Things are moving incredibly fast when it comes to our understanding of Omicron and how this informs the policies that our governments are adopting or not adopting. And to discuss those big developments, I'm joined by Oliver Barnes, health and science reporter at the Financial Times. Thank you so much for joining us, Oliver. We're going to go through sort of issue by issue. I want to start with the one that really brightened my day, which is the shortening of the time that people have to self-isolate if they test positive for COVID from 10 to 7 days. Lots of people delighted. That might mean they'll be out by Christmas Day. I have seen some people on Twitter say, oh, this is the last thing we need to do because there's already, COVID spreading. This is just going to create a few more possibilities. Why, Oliver, has this changed now? And is it a good idea?
I think it's basically a pragmatic decision. Obviously, with Omicron's kind of rapid spread, we went from a couple of weeks ago having never heard of it. Now it's, dominating the infection rates and our lives, I suppose, to a bit. The government's obviously having to contend with loads of workplace absences for businesses, but then also for essential public services. And that's because people have to isolate, right? So I think UKHSA did an analysis basically comparing how effective an isolation period is of 7 days ended with 2 lateral flow tests on day 6 and day 7, or a 10-day period with no lateral flow tests. And because they're good at picking up on people when they're actually in the infectious period, shedding virus. So they're a pretty surefire guarantee. If you're in isolation right now, Michael, am I right thinking, if you take those lateral flows on day 6 and day 7 and you've tested positive on both, that's a pretty surefire guarantee that you're not infectious and therefore you can go back out into society. And of course, that helps the government solve that kind of pragmatic problem that there are loads of absences. This is why we've seen, issues with theatres cancelling shows. And then obviously that's even worse if that goes through to essential public services like transport or the national grid or whatever.
I think to the isolation, because one thing about isolation is you can just forget about everything. It doesn't, it's going to be a set. Now you've got to do your lateral flow in the morning. You're really tense whether or not it's going to be negative. Mine was negative this morning, so I am feeling very positive right now. But I know lots of people who have been testing positive for the whole 10 days, and I can imagine that being incredibly frustrating. Let's look at the next development we have, which is on severity. So lots of studies have come out in the past 24 hours in particular. Actually, they've sort of been flooding out. I want to go to a BBC update. So they report wave of Omicron appears to be milder with potentially around 2/3 reduction in those needing hospital treatment, preliminary studies in the UK and South Africa find. Oliver, that sounds pretty good. But I also know that the data that's coming out is incredibly complicated. And when I tried to read through it, I was a bit like, there's so much going on here. How can you make sense for us of the data that's coming out on the severity of Omicron?
The main problem here, I think, that's confusing people is there are 2 issues at play. It's like severity intrinsically, i.e. this virus, an unvaccinated, non-immune person gets exposed to this. Is this a less threatening virus and is it more likely to result or less likely to result in severe disease? So that's one element of things. And then the second one is when it interacts with our very, very immune populations. In South Africa, of course, that's mainly because of prior infection. In the UK, that's because of vaccination. How will it turn out in terms of infection to hospitalization rates? What we can see pretty much from all these studies we've got in the past kind of 24 to 36 hours, that's a study from England done by Neil Ferguson's team, a study from Scotland, and also a study from South Africa, is that when Omicron does kind of hit up against and collide with a very immune population, the infection to hospitalization rate, so if you had 1,000 infections, how many hospitalizations you'd expect from that falls. The reason for that, though, is kind of unclear. And one reason that I've had posited to me by a number of experts is that because Omicron is able to cause breakthrough infections and reinfections at a higher rate, all the extra infections it would cause on top of Delta are effectively mild infections. So that makes the rate look preferable. The question that's left outstanding, of course, is whether some of this might be because of the virus kind of biologically changing to become milder. And there was a very, very slight indication from Neil Ferguson's research that was released today that perhaps it's kind of like in the ballpark of maybe 10% intrinsically milder, which is obviously great. The question that remains after that, though, is can that, slight drop off in severity compensate for the insane levels of growth that we were seeing, well, particularly last week, but we're still seeing very high levels of growth in infections. And that's the kind of, in a way, the dilemma that policymakers are having to grapple with when they think about introducing restrictions or not.
We're all now used to hearing probably that the big problem with Omicron was that even if it is even 50% less severe than Delta, for example, if you have 3 times as many cases, then you still get more people hospitalized, because a small proportion of a very, very large number can still be bigger than a large proportion of a small number. And we were all, many people still are, many people rightly are. People are very, very worried about this because of Omicron's incredible transmissibility. But also looking at the numbers over the past couple of days, I've been getting, a little bit confused, wondering how to interpret them. It might seem weird I'm saying this because there was a record 106,000 new cases today. So a record has been broken. It's not like, the cases have gone away. But if you look over the past few days, and this is the date that cases were reported. So you've got today, it was 106,000. Yesterday, 90,000. Obviously, that's a big jump. But before that, 91,000. Before that, 82,000. Before that, 90,000. Before that, 93,000. Before that, 88,000. To me, we were told these cases are going to double every 2 days, or at least Omicron was going to double every 2 days. And, it's now a majority. I'd expect those numbers to be rising quicker than they are. Before I go to you, Oliver, I just want to show London as well. So in London, where Omicron hit first, so this is sort of the canary in the coal mine, as it were, it looks like cases could even have peaked. So on the 15th of December, there were 27,650 people who tested positive. So this is on the date of the specimen, so the day that the person did the swab. You can see there the grey bars. They're grey because they're incomplete. We're expecting more results to come back. Obviously, this is not good. It's not good to have 100,000 cases a day. But at the same time, when they said it's doubling every 2 days, I was expecting to see 400,000 cases by now.
Yeah, I think the point is, in a way, exponential growth, it looks terrifying, but it can't continue on forever. It has to at some point taper off. I expect there are a number of different things at play. In London, what we've seen is, I think, I live in South London, just looking amongst my friendship group, people in their 20s, behavioral patterns have changed pretty dramatically. At one point, I think in the space of about 5 days, 3 or 4% of Lambeth tested positive for coronavirus, which is just insanely high numbers. Once that kind of bad news got out, a lot of people adapted their behavior, and that has rode back the doubling times. It does look positive. There is one uncertainty, though. We can't be sure we've come to a peak because testing capacity is kind of so stretched at the moment. Everyone wants PCR tests, and PCR tests are the way we assess a kind of peak in infections and monitor that. And in a way, it would be very helpful if the government did give a pretty accurate assessment of how strained capacity is. We can only kind of estimate from, there are 600,000 tests you can do each day under Pillar 2, which is the community testing scheme, and then we can look at the number of tests being done. But we can't be 100% sure it's actually being strained. If it's not being strained, maybe cases in London have peaked. But that is a way the uncertainty that we have to deal with. The second thing is, a lot of those infection rises we were seeing, last week, the specimen data you referred to, when there was really high specimen, really high number of cases last week. A lot of those are already baked into hospitalizations that are yet to appear. So in London today, there was a record day for hospitalizations. There were about 350 hospitalizations in a single day. That's the highest since early February. We'd expect that to continue going up. And because of what we were talking about before, about that kind of unknown around severity, we don't know quite how it's going to go, how high it's going to go from the numbers that are already baked in. So we can take some kind of hope from it, but it's definitely not a certainty that we will be able to avoid restrictions because of this.
So there were lots of announcements today and yesterday from 3 of the 4 nations. So we have new restrictions in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. We'll go through some of those now. So in Scotland, from Boxing Day for 3 weeks, there will be indoor standing events, which will be limited to 100 people, indoor seated events to 200 and outdoor events to 500. In hospitality, the 1 metre rule must be observed between groups, and there'll be no crowds for football matches because that would obviously go above 500, and pubs to provide table service only. In Wales, the rules are stricter. outdoor events will be limited to 50, with 30 for indoor events. The rule of 6 will apply in pubs and restaurants, and it will be a legal offence to organise an indoor event with more than 30 people. That's significant because in Scotland, this is all based on restrictions on businesses and advice. In Wales, they're encouraging people to limit their household mixing, but it only becomes criminal. You're only subject to a fine if you have 30 people. In Northern Ireland, new rules were announced this afternoon. So again, from Boxing Day, nightclubs will be closed. Dancing at hospitality venues, excluding weddings, will be prohibited. The rule of 6 will apply in hospitality venues, again with table service. People will be urged to limit meetings inside. So those urgings are also happening in Wales and Scotland. Face mask rules strengthened. That's also happening in all of the nations. Obviously, if you live in England, you're probably aware that nothing so far has been announced in England, and we're still expecting potentially some news in the next couple of days or on Boxing Day. It's unclear. Oliver, do you think that restrictions such as what we're seeing in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland are inevitable in England, and it's just the Tory party sort of sorting out its own internal beef? Or are there actual scientists saying that maybe we can get through this without introducing restrictions such as those?
Well, we keep on hearing from the government that they're waiting on new data, and this kind of phrase has slightly puzzled me because a lot of the data is already there in a way. The data that they are kind of waiting on is this severity data, and as we discussed earlier, even though it's a little bit positive, I'm not sure it will compensate for the really high levels of spread. I think one interesting indicator I was having a chat with this researcher who's on SPI-AM on the SAGE modelling committee yesterday, but he also works in Denmark, and Denmark have done a similar thing to Scotland. They've introduced, fairly, not super draconian, but fairly draconian restrictions. They've, shut museums, various like cultural attractions, and limited mixing in restaurants, etc. And he was saying, in a way, the UK has kind of fallen, England in particular, of course, has fallen into this kind of trap that it always does of being quite Panglossian and never taking preemptive action. I think the thing that would be bad with restrictions is, of course, if they come too late, because they may actually not kind of have any massive effect on infection rates. I'm of the opinion that it's likely that the government will have to implement restrictions, just because even if that 100,000 figure isn't growing a huge amount, if it stays stubbornly high, it's uncomfortable and it could feed through into hospitalizations. But as you were talking about earlier, if London's already peaked, what are restrictions like doing in London? They will bring the peak down quicker, but they didn't actually avert us getting to that very high point. And it's of course the high point that doctors and nurses in the NHS worry about, because if you get a really high peak in cases, you can get all your kind of hospitalizations concertinaing together over like a week or 2 weeks, and it's that dramatic kind of pressure on the health service, which is what we talk about when it's being overwhelmed. I think even if we didn't opt for Plan B, it's very unlikely we're going to get the same numbers of people in hospital at one time. Back in January last year, we had about 40,000. January this year, rather, we had about 40,000 people in hospital at one moment. I don't think we're going to get to that, but it is possible we could near the kind of daily admissions figures from January, which were in the region of like 3 to 3,500. But because of the lower severity, the kind of length of stay will be lower, and therefore people will leave hospital quicker. All of this, though, just really creates this complicated picture for the government about how what the step is next in terms of restrictions.